Consider this, according to Statistics Canada, by the year 2036, 2.6 million Canadians will be Indigenous. They have the highest fertility rate, the highest birth rate. The average age of an Indigenous Canadian is 26, compared to 40 years old for the rest of us. The Trudeau government and the policies here at the weekend have reflected policy changes, social changes, economic changes that the government would like to implement for First Nations people. But to what degree does the sheer weight of demographics mean that Canada faces unprecedented change in not only the nature of the Indigenous population, but the country's traditional relationship towards Aboriginal people? I'm joined now by two Winnipeggers from Manitoba's Indigenous communities who are going to talk about this. Niigaan James Sinclair is Chair of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba, and Grand Chief Sheila North Wilson.
Yes.
Tell me, where are you from? Where is your band?
My organization is called the Manitoba Keewatinowi Okimakanak. Represents 30 First Nations in northern Manitoba.
Right, welcome. Thank you. James, tell us what's around your neck there?
I'm a Rainbow Trout Clan member, and the head of our clan is the Turtle, and so it's a recognition of the leadership of the Turtle Clan that's I also recognize in a place like this.
Do you think we're in a critical stage of transition for Indigenous people in Canada? Will we look back on this period someday, and if we do, what will we say was happening?
Well, I think this is a turning point moment where Indigenous issues are entering the mainstream as they never have before. And one of the most important things that's recognizing that is that I think there's a recognition by mainstream parties that Indigenous peoples have a set of power. I mean, we've only been voting for 56 years now, and that we've kind of grasped that power, and we're trying to make change in the mainstream.
When you talk about voting, a lot of Canadians might not know this, but Aboriginal people have a high rate of voter participation at the local level, but not so much at the federal level. Tell us about that, Sheila.
Well, yeah, it's people have been complacent, I guess, and I think it had a lot to do with the lack of trust in the system that was there. But that's changing. I think people are starting to realize that there is power in the vote, and we saw huge numbers, even in the territory where I'm from. The vote went up by, I think, about 30%. It was higher. It was the highest it's ever been.
In the federal election?
Yes, in the federal election. Because I think there was a mobilization, there was a lot more activism, a lot of people talking about the issues and making it real for their families and for the communities. So I think people like Niigaan and other activists and even journalists when I was in journalism and people on the ground, grassroots people started to speak out. It was a new era, and it sort of started a long time ago, but even more galvanized by the Idle No More movement.
Do you think that was it? Is that what caused it?
Well, in this time, there was a lot more movements before that we probably wouldn't hear about because it wasn't social media back 23 or 30 years ago.
What I've often said about this particular time period is during the time of the past 10 years, during the Harper regime, it was a wide-scale rebuke of that regime which invoked or invited Indigenous peoples to participate within. They saw really some of the worst of the country in their treatment of Indigenous people, really the ignoring of them. And so we turned out in droves to both march in the streets, but then we also acted at the ballot box.
And what is the significance of a young population, economically and socially? What happens to a people when the population is young?
There's lots of opportunity. There is an influx of potential workers and people that will be contributing to this society. Once we all get it straight that we need to train our young people, once we get it straight that we need to create real opportunities for young people, because right now we're still not creating those opportunities as a society. You walk through any mall in Winnipeg, when we are the largest Indigenous population in this country, for a city, you don't see our people working in the malls, for example. And
why not?
Because the opportunities are not there. They're not afforded the same, entry-level welcoming into the business community and even in the, in other parts of society.
You've heard this. I've heard this. They've called Winnipeg Canada's most racist city. Is that true?
Well, absolutely not.
Where does that come from?
We don't play the racist Olympics here and try to decide who is the most racist of all. I think that was absurd. But I think also it's an important reminder to the mainstream that we have a lot of work to do.
Okay.
What I'd say is about the most powerful thing about having the youth, we're reaching 20% of just status Indigenous people here in Manitoba. And that's forcing social issues, which are really driven on the agenda of young people. Social issues are much more of interest than economical issues, although those are important too. That's why you see the biggest issues in Manitoba for young Indigenous people are the pipeline, social issues in relation to diversity, inclusion, and you see that in this Liberal Party. This Liberal Party's been able to grasp upon those issues and gain a lot of traction with young Indigenous people as a result of dealing with those social issues, and not so much focusing on the economical ones around whether we should have a pipeline. It's more about, let's talk about the pipeline, let's include all these different diverse opinions, but then also push forward the pipeline agenda, which is what's happening now.
And I would agree with that. Now, on the most part, for the southern Indigenous people, it's a little different in the north, where we're still, looking for the basic things like good housing, good education, good health care. We are among the poorest in this country, in northern Manitoba, with deplorable housing and high child poverty rates. So when they talk about, southern activists, and I consider myself part of that too. I became an advocacy journalist. But in the north where I'm from, we're still dealing with, we don't have a lot of accessibility even to the internet. So everything that we take for granted in the south is not the same in the north. So there's different dynamics going on, and I think that we all have to keep that in mind too, that we're not all on the same page just yet.
And what do you think the political implications are of this bubble, this Indigenous demographic? In that, if you imagine if all the Indigenous people on the prairies were in one place, they'd be the 6th largest province. If they were in one place, they'd have 14, 15 MPs in the House of Commons elected on Indigenous issues. What happens in the future to things like the Indian Act or the party of John A. Macdonald on the prairies when Indigenous people have economic or political power?
Well, you'd also see a huge diversity of opinions. Indigenous peoples don't belong to one political party or vote in one direction, although in the past perhaps found some voice within one political party. I think this political party is opening up a lot more. You would see a sort of a rebuke of the policies that have led to genocide and violence, the Indian Act being the main sort of bastion of that movement going back to the 19th century. You'd see a rebuke of that, you see the change of that. You wouldn't see UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, take dozens of years or a dozen years to get implement into government, or a reconciliation. Every Indigenous person I know, whether they're from a reserve or whether they're in the city, want reconciliation in this country. They want an equal opportunity. They want an opportunity for their children. They want to have clean houses, clean water. All they want is opportunity.
And last question, too. I'm wondering, the MPs here responsible for Indigenous files will tell us these are the right things to do. But I wonder to what degree it's a political strategy, too, to make sure that they capture that growing demographic. Do you see it as a political strategy, what the Liberals are doing?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think we've seen that before. There is a history and a pattern of parties promising the world and promising this and that, and I've always said I've been cautiously optimistic, but at the same time I'm very willing to work with people that are going to, make commitments and then hold them to it. So I think this is a new era, at least in the last 10 years, that the former federal government and how we felt and how we were meant to be to feel. And so I think there is a difference, a clear language difference, and even a will. I think there's more accessibility. Even my staff, when I talk to my staff and we're trying to get information from the government, it's a lot easier to get housing stats. Before we wouldn't even get anything. We'd have to go through what journalists do to get access to information. So in that way there is a willingness, but I think we're going to have to wait and see, and we're going to have to hold them to account. But the one thing I know for sure is that we're not going to be able to go backwards because we have so many people like Niigaan and other Indigenous.
And yourself.
And myself.
Listen, thank you both, Niigaan and Sheila, for your thoughtful remarks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.